Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our good friend Wes Granberg-Michaelson. Wes is a global ecumenical leader whose work has highlighted the intersection of faith with public life. He was legislative assistant to Senator Mark O. Hatfield, director of Church and Society for the World Council of Churches, and served for 17 years as the general secretary of the Reformed Church in America. He is former chair of the board of Sojourners and also serves on the boards of Church Innovations Institute and the Global Christian Forum. His new book is The Soulwork of Justice, Four Movements for Contemplative Action. And as you can see, I have a very early version of the book that doesn't even have the finished binder on it yet, so I would really appreciate getting a hold of that early. It's published by Orbis Books. Some of Wes's previous books include Without Oars, Casting Off into a Life of Pilgrimage, and Future Faith, 10 Challenges Reshaping Christianity in the 21st Century. Wes also very generously contributed to our book, How to Heal Our Divides. You can learn more at wesgm.com or on his Substack. Wes, it's so wonderful to see you again. Many congratulations on all of your fantastic work, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. It's wonderful to be talking with you again.
Yes, absolutely. Same here. So what else would you like folks to know about you?
Well, I live in Santa Fe. We've been there for 10 years, my wife Karen and I. I love to go fly fishing when I'm not doing other stuff.
Mhm.
And while we have been so-called retired there, although we're doing a lot, uh, for the last 6 months, we responded to a request and we're giving some interim pastoral leadership to Christ Lutheran Church, an ELCA congregation in Santa Fe. So we're both back in the pulpit and doing pastoral stuff, and we love it.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm not surprised, first of all, and also I know that a lot of people so appreciate all the contributions you've made in so many different ways. So, speaking of which, you've had a whole career full of really important roles. Is there anyone in particular that you'd like to tell people more about?
Well, I think the most interesting time came when, after 12 years in being in D.C., working for Mark Hatfield and then helping Jim Wallace as we started Sojourners, Karen and I went to Missoula, Montana, kind of, dropping off, leaving the fast-paced, politically intense life of D.C. We wanted to get to a place where there was more openness, where we had some rest and some opportunity to look at new ventures. And it was there that I discovered, this was back in the 80s, how Christianity had said so little about care for the earth and the environment. There was hardly any theology, and these issues were just kind of bubbling up in the secular world. In a place like Missoula, Montana, you saw all the environmental concern, and you saw no involvement really of the church. And with a lot of friends, we started an institute called the New Creation Institute, and for several years we kind of worked on those issues. That's when I did my first writing. The first books I wrote were there. We also started our family there. And it was interesting because, it's kind of off the radar. I mean, from there, through these connections, I went to the World Council of Churches and then General Secretary, Reformed Church in America. Those are more high-profile things. But this 10 years in Missoula really shaped and grounded us in many, many ways. And I like to highlight that because sometimes breaks like that prove really important as one's career develops. It was really from that time that I decided I really wanted to focus my work directly in the church
Huh.
and pursued then the course that I subsequently ended up in.
What a departure from Washington, D.C. to, kind of like Montana. I remember when I got off the plane one time up there and you smell the air. It's
Yeah,
like, oh my goodness. It's just you kind of look around and think, oh, I guess this is what it's supposed to be
yeah,
like.
yeah,
So beautiful.
yeah, it really is.
So let's talk about the new book. As I mentioned, the title is The Soul Work of Justice, Four Movements for Contemplative Action. So please tell us how this book came about.
Well, it was an interesting story, Brian. Um, in my own journey, my spiritual life really was grounded in the Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C., which was started by Gordon Cosby, books about written by Elizabeth O'Connor. This was back at the beginning of my career, my public life, and I discovered this place, and they stressed putting together one's inward journey with God and one's outward interaction in the world and seeing those as one and seeing those as integrated together, living those out in accountable small groups and with practices and discipline. And they were doing things I'd never experienced, like silent retreats and practices that now are a little more common, and also journaling. And I began writing journals as a way to kind of process, well, to process the pain and the grace in my life. A tool I found really helpful. So I kept those journals, more or less for over 50 years. By the time COVID came and we're sitting in our home in Santa Fe, my wife Karen says, "What are you ever going to do with those journals?" And I say, "I have no idea." And she said, "Well, why don't you read them through and see if there's anything there you want to pass on to our two kids?"
Ah,
So I started reading them, and actually I took a year
wow.
going through and pulling out things from my journey, a lot of whom I'd kind of forgotten, or that, there you go through these stages. Well, you keep a journal and it's a record of it all, and it all comes
Yeah.
alive. And then I began to feel, you know, there are some things here that I think might be helpful to others.
Hmm.
Some of the movements, some of the transitions I've learned, often learned the hard way. Most important things we learn in life, we learn the hard way. But lessons learned that I could pass on, and then particularly in a time when so many, well, I mean, if I look at myself as an example, my life has been really based in outward mission and activity and witness and activism, ecumenism, and all of that. It's been a really outward directed life. But it's the inward side, how that fits and what was going on, and how today, when we so urgently need devoted work for justice and for just sanity and for just a measure of human civility in this time. We need that work so much, but when I look at those who are committed to it, I say, are they going to be here for the long term?
Hmm.
And what's going to sustain us? And what's going to give us the power to do more than just be reactive to the latest outrage, but to have a center that really asks the deeper questions and that grounds us in a spiritual foundation, not in a pietistic way, but in the deepest, most profound way that will enable us to really stand and endure for the long term, because that's, I think, what we're going to need. And that's what led me to then say, well, I think I want to gather all this and put it into a book. And I talked to, well, folks like Kathy Helmers, who's an agent I've worked with, and you know her well, and
Yes.
and she worked with the material, and she and others said, "Yep, you really have something you have to work on and put together." But all that is about a 3-year process,
Wow.
and yeah, that's how it came about.
Wow, that's so. I wish I would have kept journals all the way back. I only started a few years ago, and it's very helpful. But I know what you mean in terms of like just forgetting the importance of what something was in the moment.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, sometimes I have a tendency to look back on it as, well, that was not such a big deal as I thought it was. You know what I mean? Well, that's easy for me to say now. It wasn't easy then.
Yeah, exactly.
So the fact that you captured all that feeling and the depth and the impact that it had on you, that I'm sure was very useful.
Yeah, well, and it was interesting. What was interesting it was to remember it, and
Uh,
then to ask, what is it teaching you now? And I remember I had a spiritual director who I've normally had a person like that I've worked with. And when I was thinking about doing this and I was sharing this with her, she said, well, if you do this, just realize that you're going to enter into reading all this, and it's not going to be an intellectual exercise. You're going to get drawn in emotionally and spiritually to all the stuff you were experiencing at the time. You're not going to be able to stay detached from it. And she was right. And that's partly why it took so long.
Sure, sure. Well, I just love the book. And to me, it was in the vein of a couple of other books that our audience is going to be very familiar with. One of them is Falling Upward by Richard Rohr, and the other is Faith After Doubt by Brian McLaren. And I've taken excerpts out of those books, and put them on the blog and emails, just like I will with yours. But yours, I was really glad about because it goes deeper into 4 life transitions that you articulate. Could you highlight what those are for us?
I'd love to. And first I'd say I mean, that's wonderful company to be compared to. Brian's a friend. We go fly fishing together. I love his work. And then I've been able to know Richard Rohr because I knew him from before back in Sojourners days, but he's of course here in
Yeah.
Mexico. Um, but Falling Upward, it's a fantastic book. It's actually the book that has sold more than anything else he's written.
Is that right?
So yeah, I've learned a lot. And okay, well, what I came to, Brian, is that I think this was true of my experience, but the more I talked with others, it seemed true of many that we go through these different movements in order to make a transition from a self-protected life to a surrendered life. And I put them together after a lot of work in this way. We move from self-sufficiency to belonging. And then we move from certainty, meaning kind of a trust and rational certainty, to connection, to faith more in the spiritual kind of connections we find. I could talk more about that. And then we move from grandiosity to authenticity. And then finally, we have to make this transition from control to trust. And all of those obviously are on a journey. They don't go sequentially. They depend on one's own psychological, spiritual makeup and one's life circumstances. But I think in one way or another, those are 4 movements that can be helpful as people think about what does it mean to really journey inward in a way that's going to connect me more deeply with more resilience to my outward journey.
Well, I think it's really helpful to put a spotlight on those specific transitions, right? And for people to be able to focus on how do you do that,
Mm-hmm.
right? How do you cause your life to change priorities,
Mm-hmm.
right? From the first set of things,
Yeah.
in each one of those categories to the second set of things in each one of those categories. So the fact that you lead people through that, I think, is very helpful. One of the things you discussed that dramatically affects all of us these days is the attention economy.
Mm-hmm.
And you say the following: learn to pray. I don't mean prayer that adds to the billions of tasks God is being requested to do. Rather, prayer that gradually places the core of your being in the presence of God's love. Now, personally, I don't pray very well at all. So
Mm-hmm.
I would really appreciate you expanding on this concept of prayer.
Well, I begin with this question of attention, like you say, because we are living in a time when literally billions of dollars are being spent in trying to constantly capture our attention. Where do our eyes go? Where does our attention go? And that's with our cell phones and with our screens and with all of this. When you think about it, there's this tremendous pressure to capture our attention. And attention is a limited commodity. There's only so much of it. So one of the first things we have to learn is you have to pay attention to where you pay attention. And I think ultimately that becomes a spiritual challenge because it's really saying what's going to direct the inner core of our life and where we give that attention. Because it's a choice we can make. If we don't, the choice is going to be made for us.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the situation that we're living in. I think it was Henry Nouwen who I first heard say at one point, prayer is attention.
Mm.
And that's one way to think about it.
Yeah.
That prayer is a way of trying to refocus where that center of your attention goes. And that's why I've been drawn over the years much more to those forms of prayer that, there are names for them. They're sometimes called centering prayer, often different techniques that use breathing or use silence, one thing or another. But the whole point of all those is to try to help one overcome the continual distractedness that afflicts all of us. Whenever we try to center or pray, and we have a million things that are going through our minds, and how do we get detachment from them so that we can center more deeply? And then what do you center in? Well, the quote that you read, I just believe at the beginning and end of all things, it's learning how to be present to the ever-present love of God. That's how we have the capacity to take every breath we take. Because, the truth is that God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. But we always screen ourselves from that. In many ways, we have to. There are many just practical ways in which we live, but we have to adopt those practices that allow us to have more of a chance to be open to that presence. And sometimes that comes in, it doesn't just come from being on our knees in a church or something. Sometimes that comes just, well, you say like in the smile of a newborn baby that comes into your eyes, or you're hiking and you suddenly come upon a reflection of sun in a clear lake bouncing off of mountains that are topped by snow, and you just feel like there's just something deep and beyond you here. Or sometimes it happens in the sacraments, in religious practice. There are times when I give or receive bread and wine in a particular circumstance where I suddenly feel, oh my God, this is just all beyond me. Something is happening here. These things, they just, they just come here and there, but it's a sign that we have to open our lives to being penetrated and being addressed in order to really embrace what is always there. And I think that's where at least my practice of prayer has turned. Instead of just, asking God for parking places or else. God's got enough to worry about, But if I can learn how to be present in that way, then I can also learn how to be present to all the pain and all the injustice and all the suffering in the world, because that's where God's love turns, and you're attached to that.
Well, one thing I've learned about myself is that for me, the God moments come from a much different source. And the source is the interactions I have with people like you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Just the people, the things I learned.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So here's an example. You just gave me a really valuable tool, which is whenever I hear her use the word prayer to replace it with attention.
Mm-hmm.
Whether I'm at church or whether I'm thinking about it or I'm reading, something else. That I think would really be helpful for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Understand, okay, attention. Where's my attention today or in this moment
Yeah, yeah.
or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, So thank you for
Hey.
that. That's that's really good. So you use another term in the book you introduced me to that I've never heard before. You say the following: what will have prepared you for those critical moments when self-surrender or self-protection hang in the balance? Is that holding space? So can you describe what you mean by holding space?
Yeah. You've never heard holding space because I thought it up. And I was trying to think, I was trying to think of a term to describe what I was after, and I settled on that. And what I mean, Brian, is we have to develop a kind of internal spiritual infrastructure that is put together by various practices and habits and ways of mind that allow for the the greater awareness and uh, greater attentiveness to what is happening in our life and what is happening in the world, to process it and to take it in, because everything moves so fast. You've got to figure out times and ways in which you draw back for at least a few moments or maybe for a longer period of time in order to really capture and process the depth of all that is going on. And I like to call that a holding space. What's your holding space? Now, for people, it's going to be different according to their personalities, according to their temperaments and their life experience. But examples would be, well, let's just say, for me, what I find is a disciplined time to sit in silence at the dawn of each day. I find journaling. I find periodic times of retreat. I find ways of not just studying but reflecting on either scripture or other writings that get me away from just analyzing it in a rational way, but kind of absorbing it.
Hmm.
Practices like that. I've always in my own journey, I've found a spiritual director to kind of be a guide in that, to be a helpful thing. There was a time, it's when I did the other book, Casting Off into a Life of Pilgrimages, after I went on the Camino de Santiago.
Yeah.
And so there have been times in my life when just walking to kind of no place in particular has been a part of that practice. And so you put together a series of things that become disciplines. And that's one thing I learned way back at Church of the Savior. If you're going to be serious about this, you need to adopt some disciplines to do it. It's like, if you're going to be a concert pianist, you're going to have to practice. If you're going to be an athlete, you're going to go through rigorous training. Well, if you're going to deepen your own awareness of your connection to God and and how God is attaching you to what God desires for the world in the midst of all the cruelty and injustice that we see. If you're going to be serious about that, you're going to have some discipline. That's no easy thing. And so a holding space is the way we put together a set of practices in a disciplined way to try to allow us to be more deeply attuned and to process what is going on in the world and what is going on in our lives.
Hmm. That's really helpful. Thank you. Um, so one of the transitions that you discussed in the book, and you mentioned it a moment ago, is away from certainty, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
incredibly important in our society these days, especially within the broader Christian realm.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what you replace or what we should think about replacing certainty with?
Yeah. And I think this is I mean, this is a journey that so many, at least those who come from a background like mine, I was raised in a strong conservative evangelical background and where you just had to get all the rational things right. You had to believe the right things. And then even when I went into the Reformed Church in America, the churches in the Reformed tradition, well, you got your confessions. You got to, figure out how rationally you put together the depth of faith in a way that you can memorize. It's a and so this quest for certainty is pretty strong. But I think that life circumstances, one way or another, usually demolish it. I mean, usually we realize we don't have it doesn't quite work the way it was supposed to. And so you got all this, all these patterns of ex-evangelicals, and you got all the emphasis on deconstruction and people, trying to figure out how. So this is happening all over. Your question is the right one. What do you turn to? And I don't think you turn to a better rational system. I think you turn to certainty that's more rooted in what I like to call connections. And these are connections, relationships. It may come in creation. You may be a person who really, in moments of wonder, you are connected to God's presence in ways that go beyond imagination by experiences in creation. You may experience it in times of silence and retreat, where you're trying to get free from just the rational preoccupation and instead connected to the presence of God's own overpowering love. It may come in relationships, as you suggested, where the truth to be true, because of what you've experienced in the deepest kind of encounters with other people. It may come in forms of worship where, and I mean, I find more and more people who are on this kind of journey, yeah, they may like a good sermon, but what they really want to do is connect at a deeper emotional level, often to the sacramental elements of worship.
Mm.
And I think those are the ways in which you become certain. I mean, you become certain not rationally, but certain because of what you experience through these kinds of connections. And I think for many, that's a really important transition to make.
Mm. So in your book, you share a lot of very, vulnerable things. And you talk about a difficult time in your life as follows. The deconstruction of the dream embodied in the relationship to sojourners proved to be one of the most painful times in the first half of my life. Yet going through that pain and suffering was indispensable for opening in turn the possibilities of vocational clarity, service, and ecumenical ministry that I never could have imagined. So I've heard, similar types of stories from others and experienced it myself. I think that this is a topic that's extremely important. But the tough thing is going through the transition, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So what advice do you have for people that are going through that type of kind of serious, groundbreaking transition at the moment?
Yeah, I think, well, I go back to Richard Rohr, whom you mentioned earlier, and he says very insightfully that we move from order to disorder to reorder.
Hmm.
That we don't move to new levels of transformation without some experience of loss and of pain. And that's really like we don't want to think that.
Really?
We want to think that we just move from one thing after another. But in fact, I think it's a way in which we live by the story of life, death, and resurrection. I mean, that story of our faith lived out in Jesus really becomes our story as well. That we move into life, but then confront in ways that we can't control or expect suffering and disillusionment and pain things hit us externally or internally. You can name them all: the loss of a job, or a mental breakdown, or a disease, or the death of a loved one, or a traumatic disillusionment from a period of real active involvement in justice causes. I mean, you could go on and on. We experience that kind of loss. And and instead of saying, how do we get rid of this? I think we have to say, how do we live in the midst of this, knowing that God's presence accompanies us, and that what we can look for is a taste of resurrection. Uh, because it's just true that most of the richest things that come to us in our pilgrimage come when we pass through an experience of loss. Uh, Rohr gives an interesting definition of suffering. He says we all know what pain is, but suffering is when you are not in control.
Mm.
And I think that many of the experiences we have, what happens is that we lose what we thought was our ability to control, and that opens us up in vulnerable ways where we can then really look at the pain that's there. And one quote I love is this: "Only the pain you name is available for transformation."
Mm. Mm.
And when one's in a time like that, I think you got to be reminded. You got to be reminded of that. But
Mm.
by naming what's there, that opens up the possibility of transformation.
So here's another way that you said in the book: you should learn to die before you die.
Yeah,
Which, as I get older, I really can relate
yeah, yeah.
more to that phrase.
Well, it really relates to that last transition from control to trust, because uh, the ultimate time when we face the loss of control and the invitation to trust comes at our death. Uh, my point is, if we haven't prepared for that experience until that point, it's going to be a lot more difficult. and 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 when we're able to learn that in an ultimate way, we we die unto ourselves so that the new can be born, not just at the end of life, but in the midst of life. And it's, a lot of Christ's parables, a lot of the parables of Jesus, it's about, the wheat that dies so it can be grown, that
Yeah,
he uses that image a lot. And I,
absolutely.
and I think, I think that comes to us as a message to learn how we, when we relinquish the control we think we'd like to have over our life, we're more dependent on grace, and we're more dependent on a on a conviction that God's love is in the end going to carry us through. And that's why I say that. That's what I mean by saying we need to learn to die before we die.
Yeah, you say it a little bit more directly than a parable, which is helpful for someone like me. I'd like to read one of the endorsements for your book. This is from our friend Chuck DeGroat,
Mm,
professor of pastoral care and executive director of the clinical mental health counseling program at Western Theological Seminary, who says, a much needed book for our contemporary context, exploring how the pursuit of justice must be grounded in spiritual depth, humility, and self-awareness. Now, I think a great deal of Chuck, but honestly, that sounds too limiting to me. For me, the book is not just about doing the things in the pursuit of justice. It's about, as Frederick Buechner would say, growing up.
hmm
It's important for everyone. What do you think?
Well, I think both things are true. I I really wrote this trying to get at the ways in which our inner life, our inward journey, can connect us more deeply to our outward work. And when I think of outward work, Brian, I just think of justice. I just think of the, you know, the
Mhm.
whether it's around climate or around economic insecurity or around immigration or the causes, of course, of justice and peace, or if it's Gaza or what, you know, that those are the directions that my outward action just want to go,
Mhm.
especially in this time.
Mhm.
Um, but but my conviction is that we've got to learn how to equip ourselves with these tools to really sustain the kind of witness that we need, and that it will undergird our work for justice. So that was kind of the framework I was putting it. So when I was writing it, I was thinking of many of my friends who, like me, you know, they spend all their energy trying to, trying to work for God's justice in the world.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that Chuck, or what you raise, I mean, I think, you know, you use Buechner's quote. It does mean, uh, regardless of what our outward calling may be, there's internal work we have to do in order to be really grounded and clear and rooted. Because that quote I said before, only the pain we name is available for transformation. The next sentence I use is even just as important. The pain we don't name, we will transmit.
Mm. Mm.
And all kinds of people who they're
Yeah.
committed to the right things and they're committed to the right causes, but they just have a way of, well, it's what Brene Brown says, you know, of not doing their work.
Mm.
I mean, we all have to do our inner work if we're really going to be effective in the outer stuff we do. I mean, otherwise, there's, you know, we're going to cover up a lot of a lot of good zeal with just inner rage, and we're going to be we're going to be using relationships in ways that aren't really for others, but are really transactional to kind of advance ourselves. Where, you know,
Yeah.
our own stuff is going to get in the way of
Right.
the good things we want to do.
Mhm. Mhm. So, in your Substack, you say that your elevator pitch for the book is the following. Our urgent work of God's justice must be grounded in the journey of our souls through practices that liberate us from the protected self into the surrendered self.
Mhm.
So I think, would you say that that's really what you want readers to take away from the book?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, when you do these books and you work with a publisher, like a good publisher like Orbis, you know, I mean, they do this interesting thing. They say, summarize your book in one sentence,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
summarize your book in one paragraph, and then summarize your book in 200 words. You know,
We do the same thing. When I was teaching courses about marketing books,
sure.
that's exactly what I told people to
Yep,
do.
yep. And what you just read was my attempt to kind of put this all into one sentence. I Yeah, I do think we've got to, we all have to learn how to adopt those practices and internal disciplines that really make the transition. And it's a phrase that I also have liked to use, that allow us to move from the protected self to the surrendered self. And you know, this is over a lifetime, and no one, you know, no one ever gets there perfectly. We're all in the mess of our lives, and we're all trying to figure. But you know, you put these themes before you, and at least it kind of sets you on a path, and you kind of know the direction you want to go in, and you know you're not going to get there tomorrow, and you know you're going to keep failing, but you know you're going to be you're going to be at a different place tomorrow than you were last week. And one of the advantages I had when I read through these journals for 50 years that it gives you a perspective where you realize, okay, I mean, like, if you were my therapist or my spiritual director, I'd give you a list of the stuff I'm working on today. It's like I'm working on stuff. But when I look back over my life, I could see the ways in which, oh my, I was caught in all kinds of stuff, and somehow through pain and grace, I made it through that, and I got to this other place, and then I got to this other, and you know, I was able to finally find some healing there. Not on the timetable I wanted or the way I wanted, but it came, and so I mean, I think that's the kind of reassurance we
Yeah,
want to have.
yeah. So I know you're in the midst of launching this great new book, but I have to ask you if there's any other future books or other projects that you're able to talk about at this point?
Well, I think the one thing I'd mention is in a whole different other realm, Brian. It's in my ecumenical work. And I've continued ecumenically, especially working with the Global Christian Forum, which is 25 years now, an ecumenical initiative that we've been able to put together the Vatican's work with their dicastery on promoting Christian unity, with the World Evangelical Alliance, with the Pentecostal World Fellowship, with the World Council of Churches, the variety, across the board of these different expressions of Christianity, be able to bring them around a common table and build a kind of unity that overcomes the stereotypes. When I wrote the piece in How to Deal with Our Divides, this is the example that I used in your book. Well, the 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 next challenge that I've been working on in this with our executive director, the Roman Catholic Church has something called a World Youth Day that they have about every 4 or 5 years
Hmm.
at a big city, and it attracts 400, 500, even a million young people from around the world. These are amazing events. They were started by John Paul II,
Hmm.
and now they've continued. And if you're not within the Catholic world, you don't necessarily hear about them, but it's the most dramatic gathering of young people in one place and one time within the Christian world that happens. Our vision and what I've been kind of working on is, why couldn't we make that into an ecumenical World Youth Day?
Hmm.
Why couldn't we take what we've done within the Global Christian Forum and say, it's not just Catholic young people that get. What would it mean if you had 2 or 3 million young people from all the various traditions gathering like that? Think of what that would do ecumenically. Think of what that would do for the encouragement of young people in their own struggle to find faith and to live it out. So we've been in discussions with the Vatican and trying to plant the seed and say, what if we took what you're doing and open it up?
Hmm.
And when you do these things, you have to sort of become a diplomat. And so,
Sure.
and I end up saying it's led in the past 2 weeks to discussions that I can't tell you about.
Sure. Good. Good. That's great.
But if you say, what else captures my own heart and attention when I'm not thinking about the book? Well, it's initiatives,
Yeah.
particularly that.
That's excellent. Well, I'll be looking forward to hearing more about that when the time is ready, but I can imagine it's a very long process.
And it's a continuation of, some of the themes you've worked on in how do we heal our divides? How do we at any level figure out ways to overcome the things that typically have kept us in silos and kept us suspicious of one another.
Yeah. Well, Wes, it was so great to be able to catch up with you and, hear about this book. As I've been telling people, it's like I'm thrilled with it. The Soulwork of Justice, 4 Movements to Contemplative Action. And go check it out at wesgm.com or at Orbis Books. Wes, thanks so much again for all of your incredible work and for bringing us this great one.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thanks for your time and your interest. Over the years, you've done so much for so many writers, and we're deeply, deeply grateful to you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been a blessing to me.
Right.